Welcome back. Our second panel will be starting right now, and we have two amazing panelists. The subject is on legislative updates. We have Sharifa Abassi, who's an attorney with the HMA law firm, licensed in Virginia and Maryland. Originally from Afghanistan, she's a tireless advocate for her clients and focuses her practice on removal defense, U visas, CJIS, citizenship matters, and business immigration. Prior to joining the HMA law firm, Ms. Abassi served as legal and congressional counselor with the Embassy of Afghanistan in Washington, D.C. And in this role, she frequently represented the embassy's legal interests before the U.S. Department of State and managed all the legal matters, including detainee removal, contractual obligations, and bilateral agreements between Afghanistan and the U.S. Our other star is attorney Margaret Stock, who is a retired lieutenant colonel, the Army, U.S. Army. She's nationally recognized as an authority on matters of immigration and citizenship, national security, and the military. And Margaret is always helping everyone on every listserv I ever go on. She is, throughout her career, she's held teaching positions at West Point and the University of Alaska in Anchorage. Currently providing expert testimony before Congress, developing several programs to benefit immigrants in the U.S. Armed Forces, and most notably, the Military Accessions Vital to National Interest, the MAVNI program. Currently, Margaret is the owner and managing attorney of Cascadia Cross-Border Law Group in Anchorage, Alaska, and she advocates on a variety of client matters before the myriad courts and agencies that make up the U.S. immigration system. She was recognized in 2013 as a MacArthur Foundation Fellow for her work in the field of immigration and national security. And she's the author of Immigration Law and the Military, first published by AILA in 2012, and she co-anchored a 5th edition of Professionals, a Matter of Degree with fellow immigration law member Martin Lawler. She's a regular speaker on U.S. and international immigration matters. She'll be with us several times today, and we are just pleased as we can be to welcome both Margaret and Sharifa. Please take it away.
Looks like I need to unmute my.
You're fine, yeah.
Okay, I was going to go ahead and share screen, and
Perfect.
Let's see if we can do this.
And I remind everyone to put their questions in the chat box.
Are people able to see the screen?
Yes.
All right, and we were just going to give you a brief update on legislation. I want to preface this by saying that we're, of course, in a polarized environment right now. And one party, unfortunately, the Republican Party, has decided that immigration is a wedge issue, which means that they're not necessarily interested in any solutions because not solving the problem gets more votes. That's kind of the nutshell of what's going on with the legislation. But of course, legislation is desperately needed in the situation of the Afghans who have been paroled into the United States and also the ones who haven't made it yet into the US. And one of the reasons legislation is needed is because otherwise we have hundreds of thousands of people that are going to need to get paroled into the United States who are already been paroled and are going to be needing to file asylum applications into an asylum system that is incredibly backlogged, where it takes years and years and years right now to be getting an interview. And this is just not an acceptable solution for the problem. So our intent here is to kind of give you just a brief update on some of the legislation that's pending, and then discuss what legislation might actually pass, if any. I think Sharifa is going to weigh in on that. So focus here, of course, is on Afghans and their situation. Your best reference for reading up on particular laws, of course, is to go to the congress.gov website. The Afghan Adjustment Act has been a lot in the news, but it's just proposed at the moment. And I have a link to a fact sheet there. I'll provide these slides to everybody so you can check out the fact sheet. But HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, has put out a really helpful fact sheet on the Afghan Adjustment Act and why it's needed. We'll be talking a little bit more about that as well. It would provide that Afghans paroled into the United States would be allowed to adjust their status. So they wouldn't have to file asylum applications and wait 5 or 6 years for interviews. They wouldn't have to worry about being deported. They would just go straight to a green card. This makes absolutely logical sense because it wouldn't require nonprofits and groups such as yourself and Ayla and other folks to jump in and file asylum applications for everybody. Instead, they would go straight to a green card. Makes absolute sense. Precedent exists in other areas. This is a very common solution when you have a mass refugee crisis like this. Recently, in fact, Congress managed to do it with the Liberians. They finally gave them an Adjustment Act. Haven't heard anybody complaining about it at all. However, it did take decades for the Liberians to get their Adjustment Act. The Cubans similarly have long had an Adjustment Act where Cubans who end up in the United States can get a green card relatively easily after being here for about a year. And there's no reason in the world why they can't do it, the Afghans, except for politics. Sharifa, did you want to go ahead and comment on the Afghan Adjustment Act?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I think, Margaret, you covered most of the points I wanted to touch on. I did want to mention a few things in regards to the act. The act does need bipartisan support, and I think that's the holdup is with the Republicans. We can't really find a Republican sponsor for the act. So I think one way the public can have some sort of influence on this is if you do call your, congressman's office, and there's actually a scripted text that you can read off of to get them to support this act. And like Margaret said, I think every advocate who is involved in this Afghan refugee crisis were a big proponent of this, not just for the Afghan parolees or for the Afghan refugees for their sake, but also for the sake of our entire immigration system. Because as Margaret said, it is completely backlogged. The asylum option, the asylum system is completely backlogged, and there is just not enough immigration attorneys to handle this many immigration asylum cases. And with all of these people coming through, there's a good percentage of them that are SIV eligible, and so they can apply for a green card through the SIV process, but a majority of them will have to go through the asylum route in order to get some sort of permanent status here. And with the backlog that we have in the system, also the inability to have pro bono representation for all of these people, a lot of them are gonna end up falling out of status, in 2 years' time, and they definitely will not be able to file within the 1-year deadline, given that they have spent most of their time on the military bases, where they have not, been able to meet with a lawyer to get their cases started. So like Margaret said, this has been done before in other situations like the Cuban Adjustment Act and the Liberian Adjustment Act. This has been done before, and I personally see it as the only feasible solution here. So the support is definitely much needed, and we need to get it passed. So that's what I have to add to this.
Yeah, so the 1-year filing deadline for asylum is looming. It's only a few months away for a lot of people. And we are going to have a session later on filing an asylum application for somebody from Afghanistan, but it is not an easy thing. It doesn't take 5 minutes, it's hours and hours of work typically to get a good asylum application filed, and so this is going to be a tremendous amount of work for attorneys, and having an Afghan Adjustment Act would alleviate things considerably.
I agree. And you have to understand that a lot of these people that did come, that were evacuated, there are families or populations from the rural areas of Afghanistan. A lot of them are not very educated, and so for them to pro se applications is out of the question for these people. And I think even if the Afghan Adjustment Act does get passed, there will need to be something filed even in that case for them, and even with that they'll need an attorney, but at least it's less of a burden on the attorneys. It's much easier to file an I-45 versus an I-589, an asylum application. So that's another reason why this is definitely needed.
Okay, so we're all going to go out and advocate for the Afghan Adjustment Act as soon as the seminar's over to alleviate the burden on us. But in any event, I did want to cover some legislation that did pass last year. Oh, sorry, wait a minute. Here we go. I'm going to cover some legislation that's currently pending, and apologize for the typo there. Now, I'm not going to cover every single thing that's pending in Congress right now. I just wanted to highlight a few pieces of legislation just to let you know what the landscape is out there. So this is a bill that's pending in the Senate with a Republican who had introduced it, Josh Hawley. He's been pretty active on Afghanistan evacuee legislation. This particular bill requires in-person vetting of everyone evacuated from Afghanistan with special database and reporting on evacuated Afghans, and prevents them from getting unemployment and means-tested benefits if they haven't been vetted. Now, I just want to mention this. I don't think this bill actually has any chance of passing. I would hope not, but consider a requirement that would require every single person who got evacuated to have an interview with some Department of Homeland Security person, a security interview before they could get any unemployment or means tested public benefits. I mean, this is like kind of nuts. And there's absolutely no personnel in the bureaucracy who are available to do this. I mean, they're already completely overwhelmed with doing interviews of different people and everything. Reason I mention this bill is because it presents a theme that's out there that is actually a false theme that you just have to be aware of. And this theme is that somehow the US evacuated a whole bunch of really dangerous people without vetting them. This did not actually happen. In fact, the misbehavior among Afghans who got evacuated is, if you look at the percentage of misbehavior compared to the general population, they are an extraordinarily well-behaved group of people statistically. So you will hear a lot of rumors that we let a lot of really dangerous people into the country and didn't vet them. These are not true, but these rumors are driving a lot of, bills like this one that you should just be aware of. Again, I don't think this has any chance of passing, but it's out there.
And Margaret,
sorry,
I just also wanted to mention that, everyone who is evacuated, they are in fact vetted.
They are vetted.
Yeah, so no one just got onto a plane and just came here. There were several points where they have been vetted. And even after people, after they came through the port of entry at the airports here, I guess people that have been of concern, there has been a lot of, I guess, recent FBI visits, like frequently, by the FBI to do further vetting. So the vetting has been done and it's continuing to be done. Basically make sense for this rhetoric.
Yeah, and my experience with this kind of thing, just so I've been involved a lot with DoD background and security vetting involving people in the military. The vetting that they do actually a lot of times is completely incompetent. So, it's like this show that we're going to go and do vetting of people. And they often send people out to do the vetting that don't know anything about the country that they're vetting them from. So they ask silly questions, or they vet them for, foreign ties, because that's what they're supposed to vet people for, foreign ties. So they do a 5 or 6 hour interview and they discover it was revealed that you have foreign parents, I mean, this is like, if the public knew what the kind of vetting that was going on and observed it in a lot of these cases, people would just be appalled. It's not serious practical vetting designed to figure out whether somebody's an actual kind of threat. It's vetting for standard factors that the government has decided are dangerous, like foreign ties. And it's crazy. And, for somebody to mandate that you have to do an interview like this for everybody, it makes absolutely no sense. And it probably would accomplish nothing except mess up the whole entire system and make people, unable to support their families for a long time. But any event, moving on the positive side, there has been some movement in both the House and the Senate to recognize threats against certain groups in Afghanistan and to try to at least recognize that this is a threat, presumably, so people would be eligible for refugee status or for asylum in the United States. Bill on both the House and the Senate side, this doesn't actually do anything other than recognize the threat, but it's something you can point to if you're handling an asylum application. that people in Congress have publicly announced that they believe there is a threat. And so this would be documentation that you might be able to use to back up a claim for asylum. And then there's been a bill introduced in the House that requires the Department of State to report on funding provided by the State Department to NGOs to evacuate people from Afghanistan, and to report on how many people are still seeking evacuation. This particular bill, they want to report on people who are eligible for SIV and for U.S. refugee program categories P1, P2, and P3. I'm not sure this one has any chance of passing either, but at least it's requiring somebody to recognize that we left a lot of people behind and talk about how many of them are potentially being evacuated, and to focus on whether State Department has actually been doing anything to try to get people out, which a lot of us have concerns that they haven't been doing anything. This is an older bill, December 2021. Richard Blumenthal is a fairly powerful senator, but on the Democrat side, requiring another plan for and a strategy for evacuating Afghans. It does require security checks to be conducted before they depart Afghanistan. This one's interesting because he's mandating in the bill that the security checks be conducted remotely before people depart Afghanistan. And I, as a practical matter, I'm not sure how that would work, because you need pictures and biometrics. And so some American person from the government would have to get into Afghanistan and collect this information from people. And this seems unlikely to me, but he's also recognizing this thread that Afghans are dangerous and we can't let them into the United States until we do a lot of vetting. So he wants people to have a place outside the US to wait for their clearance to come to the United States, kind of like what's been going on in the Middle East. And he wants monthly reports to Congress. A big theme of all the Afghan legislation that's been introduced is reporting to Congress, telling Congress about things. And this is another thing that I just add an editorial comment that, the government has spent so much time reporting things to Congress that they actually have no time to get any work done because there are so many reports mandated. And they also don't comply with a lot of the reporting requirements because there's too many of them. So Congress is forever mandating reporting from the Pentagon, and most of the time they never get it. And this is mandating the State Department and DHS. And, I know people are supposed to comply with legislation, but there's no enforcement mechanism when they don't report. So a lot of times they just pass a bill and say, you got to report this and you got to report that. And it just doesn't happen. Another one, House bill, says that they have to prioritize for evacuation and submit a strategy and reports. Another one for SIVs to add Fulbright scholars to the list of Afghans who are eligible for SIVs. This would be a fairly small population, but it's interesting that they singled out Fulbrights to try to add them to the SIV list. And then this bill, it actually happened already in some form last summer, but I thought it would be interesting for people to know that there is a push out there to increase SIVs even more and not have any numerical limitations on spouses and children, which would mean that you wouldn't use up the quota, which would be nice. Okay, so I think that was a quick and dirty. I didn't go over every single bill that's pending in Congress because there are actually dozens and dozens of them. Most of them mention things like security checking and evacuation. So I think those are kind of the two themes. There is no Afghan Adjustment Act that's got a lot of partners or has been introduced yet. That's actually the bill that would help solve the problem. So most of the pending legislation right now, I would say, is picture legislation. It's not really things that are going to do much to help solve the problem. It's photo op type legislation that lets people get out there and claim to their constituents ahead of an election that they introduced a bill, but not necessarily that it solved any kinds of problems. Okay, so I think we have some questions. Sharifa, did you want to add any commentary?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, Margaret. I guess one positive thing that we've gotten, or a positive update that we've gotten, is that TPS was actually, Afghanistan was designated, TPS was designated for Afghanistan on March 16th. And I think that had to do a lot with the TPS being designated for Ukraine. That had a lot to do with it. So that's one positive development, I guess, that we have now, is that it has been officially designated, but unfortunately on the other side, it has not been published yet. So that,
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Of course, TPS isn't legislation per se. It's the authority of the Secretary of Homeland Security to designate countries. And we have seen, and I think there's no point in hiding the ball here, that there has been absolutely bad treatment of the Afghans compared to the Ukrainians for reasons that I think people can discern on their own. For whatever reason, the Ukrainians are getting, all kinds of excellent treatment that we wish would apply to everybody. It's, really not fair that our Afghan allies are getting worse treatment than the Ukrainians. Not the Ukrainians weren't our allies for one thing, but, and I understand the strategic implications of Ukraine and the horrible treatment that the Russians are giving the Ukrainians, but they gave equally horrible treatment to the Afghans. And much worse things happened in Afghanistan. So it kind of boggles your mind that the government has decided that one group is worthier than another, and they're just not going to treat everybody equally well. It's just not fair, but at least TPS is
and
something.
we've been, like Margaret said, we were advocating for TPS since August. And it's really unfortunate, and it's sad that the only reason they designated TPS was right after they designated TPS for Ukraine. That was what put the pressure on them. And as of right now, the register hasn't been even published yet. It was published for Ukraine and for Sudan, but not for Afghanistan yet. So
Right, and not to mention another country, but Cameroon has also been supposedly announced for TPS, and they haven't been designated either. And that's another war-torn country that people don't seem to pay a whole lot of attention to. Although in Maryland, there's a lot of Cameroonians, so some of you may be running into folks from Cameroon that are going to be eligible. Okay, I think I'll just go really quick into the chat and try to answer some of the questions in the chat. One of the questions was, are all of the proposed bills having the same challenge of not getting bipartisan support? For the most part, yes. There was a push last summer where there were positive changes made to the SIV program that had bipartisan support, and we'll talk about that when we get to the SIV program. There were very positive changes made that made more people eligible. But since then, I think because it's an election year, they've gone back to the usual thing they do in Congress when people are running for office, which is to focus on wedge issues and not actually try to get anything done as a practical matter. So there's been just extreme polarization, and I'm just not seeing a whole lot of bipartisan support on anything to do with Afghanistan at the moment, as far as legislation goes. And then another question we had was the proposed Afghan Adjustment Act. What kinds of vetting? So this is the standard kind of vetting that actually works and makes sense. If the Afghan Adjustment Act, you would file an I-485, you would come in, you would have your picture taken and your fingerprints done, and the government would run the picture and the fingerprints through its regular old government databases that pick up all kinds of stuff that you did that was bad. So they would find out anything associated with any US government database. It's actually the same vetting that they try to do overseas with the Afghans, except that it's easier for them to do it in the United States because they can just send you into an application support center. And there are contractors who know how to take your picture and do your fingerprints and run everything through the system. And then USCIS picks up the data at their end. So I don't actually see any problem with doing it for people inside the United States the way they normally do for anybody. They have access to the same databases. It's just USCIS people doing it rather than other folks designated to do it overseas. So don't really see a problem with that. And then I think we have another question in the chat that I'm trying to pull up that's older. So hold on one second. Get to the back of the...
There's a question on here. I'm looking at it. It says, are military attorneys barred from pro bono for refugees, or might we recruit them too? So,
okay.
Go ahead, Margaret, you want to?
Oh, no, go ahead. You were going to say something. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, anyone can offer pro bono representation. I would just say because there's just not enough immigration attorneys to cover, pro bono for all these people. So we are going to need, attorneys from other practice areas to volunteer their time in to take pro bono cases. They would just need the right training for it. And there's so many resources for training out there by a lot of these legal nonprofit providers. So as long as you have the right training, I don't see any reason why you would be barred to represent pro bono.
Okay, so the question had to do, though, I think, specifically with military attorneys. And some military attorneys would not be allowed to file a pro bono asylum or refugee case just because of their job. You know, they're full-time active duty military. But certainly the National Guard and Reserve attorneys probably would be able to do this. In fact, I've had some inquiries from the California National Guard. They have a legal office there that's interested in helping out with Afghans. And they were seeking some training on how to get their, you know, attorneys, National Guard attorneys. These are part-time people. So in real life, quote unquote, we call it real life when you're reservist. They're civilian attorneys, but then they work part-time for the National Guard on the weekends. And they're really interested in the Afghan issue, but most of them don't have a background in immigration law, so they would need mentoring. It is certainly entirely possible for an attorney who is not experienced in immigration law to be mentored through an asylum application by another experienced attorney. It's actually not that hard to do because it's a, you know, if it's been, the case has been screened already by an expert immigration attorney and the expert has said this person's eligible for asylum and this is where they're, how they're eligible, this is their social group or whatever, you can usually train a pro bono attorney relatively quickly to file a case once it's been screened. So I think that's a good thing. And if you're in your area, you might want to reach out to military reserve units and National Guard to see if they have anybody who's available who might be willing to do it. Okay, and then somebody asked what we should advocate for when calling Congress, and it's a key line is pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, need co-sponsors. You know, that's really the key. It's a pretty simple message. Let them get their green cards. If you're looking for a security reason for doing this as well, and I just throw this in as a military person, I'm getting hordes of calls from military vets who are trying to help Afghans join the US military, either because they are interested in joining the military after having been evacuated or because they worked with the military over in Afghanistan. Particularly compelling group that reached out to me was Save Our Sisters, which is a group of women veterans who worked with Afghan women in Afghanistan and want our sisters, you know, as we call them, to be allowed to join the US military. They can't join the military if they don't have a green card. Refugees, asylees, parolees are not eligible to serve in the United States military right now. They have to get a green card. So this is another reason that might appeal to people more on the Republican side of the House, is if you have a specific individual you can bring to them and say, hey, I want to join the US military, but I can't because I don't have a green card. And I'm a great candidate because I worked with the US military before in Afghanistan. They could really use me right now because they're desperate for troops. The Army's not meeting its recruiting goals right now. They can't find enough qualified Americans to fill the ranks. I would like to join, but I can't join unless I get a green card. And the only way I can get a green card is through the Afghan Adjustment Act. I filed for asylum, but it's going to take them 5 or 6 years to get to my case probably. Or even if they've interviewed me recently, I'm not getting any decision on that. And even if I get granted asylum, I'm going to have to wait a whole year to apply for a green card. So if you want me to be serving the country that rescued me from Afghanistan, I would like a green card right now so I can go down to the recruiting office and sign up. That message might resonate with some people. Question in the chat was what's going on with the MAVNI program? The Obama administration killed the MAVNI program in 2016. So there is no more MAVNI program. It's not available. It was temporarily killed by the Obama administration in the fall of 2016 and then permanently killed by the Trump administration a year later. So there's no MAVNI program. And then I don't recall the date off the top of my head about TPS.
March 15th.
March 15th.
March 15th
Okay.
of 2022. You had to have been in the United States as of March 15th.
Right. Okay. All right. Sharifa, did you want to go ahead and comment on legislation? I think we got a couple more minutes, maybe a minute, right?
You have a few more minutes because we have a long lunch break. So if you need, take what you need.
I mean, I think, Margaret, I think I addressed everything that I wanted to address in terms of the legislation, and and I will just I reiterate that support for the Afghan Adjustment Act is much needed. Otherwise, it's going to create all kinds of problems on attorneys, on the system, on the refugees themselves. So that's basically my closing point for this, Margaret.
Okay, and then we got one more comment in the chat, which was apply for TPS and then do an EB3. This is a good comment because I think a lot of people aren't thinking about employment-based categories for Afghans, but the priority dates are current for Afghanistan in the employment-based categories. So there's no waiting period. If somebody from Afghanistan qualifies under an employment-based category. The only trick you have to worry about here is you got to make sure that they are in status for purposes of adjusting their status in the employment-based categories. And this is tricky because if you go look at INA 245K, there's pretty strict rules about people in the employment-based category adjusting their status. And unless DHS is going to give them an exemption from 245K, there might be a problem with a lot of these folks adjusting in the employment-based categories. And then that means if they can't adjust, they got to go do consular processing, which is going to be a nightmare for somebody from Afghanistan to try to find a country where they can go do their employment-based consular interview and so forth. And I don't think most of them are going to want to leave the US to go do that. So that's potentially an issue, but you should not overlook the employment-based categories for Afghans. They are definitely viable for a lot of folks. And the chat person mentioned EB3, but I've actually run into Afghans who got evacuated who are eligible for EB1 or EB2 national interest waivers. Recently, I got an EB2 national interest waiver for somebody from Pakistan who wanted to join the US Army and spoke several languages that the Army needs. Believe it or not, he didn't have a master's degree either. I just argued he was exceptional because he spoke 5 languages, including Urdu and Dari. And the government approved his green card in the EB2 national interest waiver because he wanted to join the Army and he needed a green card to join the Army. So that's a possibility. Unfortunately, an EB2 national interest waiver is a lot of work. And I think I put in about $7,000 worth of work into the case, including dealing with an RFE. It's obviously not feasible for people to do that on a mass scale, but in individual cases, it might be something that you can do. Particularly if you're an employment-based immigration lawyer, this might be a lot of fun for you.
Okay, any final thoughts? If not, we will take our lunch break now. And we thank Margaret and we thank Sharifa, and we will be seeing them again later today.
I look forward to being with you later today. Thank you so much.
See you all later. Thank you.
I'm going to take a breakfast break for me.